Well, hello. Thank you for joining me. I seem to have been muted. My name is Sydney Ross, and I'll be your host today. We have a wonderful episode for you, Native Plants at Noon on the Road to Maple Woods. We will be discussing old growth forests and spring ephemerals seen right here in the Gladstone area in Missouri with guest speaker Chuck Connor, Community Forester of Missouri Department of Conservation. But before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. Join me 5 times a month for Work and Learn Gardening Days at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center in Kansas City. Learn skills, connect with nature, and have fun. We have a Work and Learn session scheduled this Saturday from 8 to 10 a.m. Following these messages, I will drop links into the chat so you can check it out and sign up today. Later this month, and actually a week from this Saturday, April 27th, we have our Deep Roots Spring Native Plant Sale. Join us at Metropolitan Community College, Longview Campus in Lee Summit from 10 to 2 p.m. to get your native plants for your garden. We will have nurseries including City Roots, Galena's Garden, Missouri Wildflower Nursery, as well as local artisan Leaf and Sky. It'll be a great day to get out and see what's blooming, talk to vendors about what plants you might want to add to your garden, and just enjoy the springtime you have there. So go ahead and join us for that. You can scan this code or check the link in the chat here following these messages. I'd also like to mention our Deep Roots Habitat Garden Tours presented by the Gottmeyer Family Foundation. For those who joined us just a couple weeks ago, I'd love to hear about your experiences of these garden tours in the chat. We visited 3 gardens in Merriam, Kansas, which were magical and full of spring blooms. I want to hear what your favorite flowers were that you saw that day. But you can join us every second Saturday from now through October as we explore different gardens across the Kansas City region. Next month, we'll be in Crestwood looking at native plants in formal and informal settings among the symmetry rather seen in the architecture in that area. So I'm especially excited because I think it's a nice balance to see just how people utilize native plants in different settings, right? Also looking at the different architectural styles and how to complement that. So I'm especially excited for this series that has just begun last month, and I will include information about that in the chat as well. Also, a special thank you to our sponsor, Missouri Department of Conservation, for bringing people closer to nature, and to our viewers like you for allowing us to bring educational content to the greater Kansas City region. This webinar will be recorded, and all resources will be available online. Following this episode, I will email you all resources that discuss different topics from today's program. And don't forget, drop your comments in the chat and put your questions in the Q&A. Following the presentation, Chuck Connor will join us for a Q&A to go over any of your burning questions. And if you'd like to view our previous episodes and see information about upcoming events, please visit deeproots.org. All right, now what you all have been waiting for. Before we get started, I would just like to go ahead and introduce Chuck Connor, our community forester with Missouri Department of Conservation. Chuck Connor is a community forester in the Kansas City region. He has over 36 years of experience as a professional forester. He works with trees and the people who care for them in Jackson, Cass, Lafayette, and Johnson County, Missouri. His duties include 2 counties of private land forestry technical service and urban forestry program delivery in the Kansas City metro area. He has previously worked for the forestry departments of Southern Illinois University, South Dakota State University, and Purdue University. He has 10 years management experience in the landscaping industry and is an International Society of Arboriculture Certified Arborist Municipal Specialist. I am so excited for him to join us for today's Q&A at the end, and I hope you all enjoy the video that we put together hiking Maple Woods Natural Area in Gladstone, Missouri. Please enjoy.
Hi there, I'm Chuck Connor. I'm a community forester with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I don't manage Maple Woods Natural Area anymore, but for about 15 years I did, and we're here today to take a look at it. This is a wonderful area for the Gladstone area to come out and recreate. It's starting to melt out. It's at its age where it's past its prime now. It was old growth forest when we got it, and is everything. Even trees are a longer lifespan, but it's not infinite, and the older trees now are starting to go. Isolated old growth just means it's old. It's been around for a long time. Probably hasn't had a harvest for, depending on what your definition is, 75 to 100 plus years. The trees here were very old. They're over 150 years old, most of them. And but it's also an urbanized island now. You know, when you think about it, most of this area looked like it, and now it's literally a 37-acre island surrounded by subdivisions, highways, and commercial development. So why we manage this for conservation and to try to protect this resource, it's also hard to do without corridors where you can get migration of animals in and out of the area, which we just don't have on this here.
Yeah, it's kind of akin to a food desert, isn't it? This is like, you got a small oasis here, but then everywhere around it, it's desolate and doesn't provide support for our wildlife.
Well, and if your mode of travel is on ground base, if you're not a bird, and let's say box turtles, and the last one gets run over in the parking lot, it's very hard to migrate from other islands into this and repopulate that, just because, again, it's surrounded by ecosystems that have been impacted by urbanization. So again, it's very difficult once you lose something here to regain it back in. It's a designated natural area, and it's a maple, basswood, oak forest is what it is. And since it's an old growth forest, what's occurring is we're losing the oak species as it gets older, because oak are what are called a shade intolerant species. They can't grow big in shade. So it all started at the beginning. There was probably some kind of event here that totally set succession back to square one. Whether it was an ice storm, or straight line winds, or a tornado, or possibly a fire, but fires usually don't occur on forest soils because they're too wet, and there's just too much vegetation. Fire doesn't carry very easily in true forest. But it was something that set it back to bare dirt. And oak and maple and basswood all grew up at the same time and had this mixed hardwood forests here. But as they grow older, like I said, forests have very different, many layers in them. The oaks are in the very top where they get full sun, but they can't grow from acorns. There are no smaller oaks in here because they're intolerant of shade, where the maple are shade tolerant, and all the younger trees in here are maples. So as they're getting older, and the drought of 2012 and the last 2 years we've had horrible drought too, that's pushing these older oaks that are nearing the end of their lifespan. A lot of them are starting to die and fall over, and the only thing replacing them now are those shade tolerant species, which are primarily, this is going almost to a full maple stand, and that's pretty for fall color. but it's not as good for the wildlife that depends on these areas, because there are plenty of species of animals that depend on maple, but not near as many as depend on oak. Of all the genuses of plants in the world, Quercus, the oak family, more species of life depend on that for food, reproduction, or habitat than any other plant in the world. So it's still going to be pretty, it's still going to be a forest, but the ecological value of the trees to wildlife is starting to decline with the loss of those oak species. But there's still, the main species in here are white oak, Burr Oak, and northern red oak. There's a few Chinkapin oak, but again, all their numbers are declining as they get old. We're to that point in succession where they're just melting out. They're starting to die out of the stand.
Yeah.
So.
That's very fascinating. I didn't realize that the intolerance or tolerance of shade for maples and oaks, and I think that's really interesting to think about. And you mentioned keystone species. You know, you said you described the definition of that, and that just want to remind the audience that those are our MVPs, our most valuable players in the food web. And if we, you could plant your whole garden with native plants, and if you don't have a single keystone species, you're missing about, I think Doug Talmy said, like 75% of support for wildlife. So definitely something to consider, right?
Well, and going back to how to make the world a better place in your own habitat, planting native species is wonderful on your property. And if you have room for a large shade tree, a native oak tree is what to plant, right? Because again, more species of life depend on our oaks than any other tree.
Yeah.
And just through development pressures, we're losing a lot of our oak trees, well, our forests in general, just through housing and commercial development.
That makes sense. So as individuals in this area, folks who live in Gladstone, or anywhere really, what are some things that we can do to help support wildlife?
Plant native plants in your yard. That's the biggest thing. When we make new development, the first thing we do is bring in the bulldozers to get a grade on there where they'll drain for rainwater. But then when we replant with totally non-native species, fescue, bluegrass, non-native trees, we totally break that insect food web, which all other life depends on. So coming back in with native plants in your yard is one of the best things you can do for the food web and the environment, and to lower your impact on it.
Oh.
The difference between a woodland and a forest is a forest is more closed, and as you can tell there, the trees are in tight, and there's also multiple layers of trees. You have huge trees that form the upper canopy, then medium trees that form kind of a mid-story or middle layer, and then like pawpaw and these smaller shrubby species that form an understory. So what happens in a true forest is the ground layer comes up and looks beautiful in the spring, but then it peaks in the spring. And then as the trees leaf out, the shade gets heavier and heavier and heavier until the summer and fall. This is pretty much bare dirt or leaf litter here. And that's why they call them spring ephemerals. They're here during the spring, but just for a short period of time till they're shaded out. They have to do their entire life cycle very quickly. In fact, something's blooming up there.
Ooh.
But once summer comes, it's so shaded out that all of this is gone. It's past. It's very ephemeral or short-lived here.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a woodland, you have instead of a lot of different layers, you just have a canopy of trees, and they're usually spaced wider apart, where enough sunlight gets on the forest floor where stuff will bloom spring, but also summer and fall. There's always something blooming on the ground flora, and it's always here. And that's, for me anyway, one of the easiest ways to tell a woodland apart from a forest, especially in the summertime. If you're walking through and it's bare ground, you're definitely in a forest, where if you've got coneflowers and bidens and other things blooming, you're more in a woodland setting, especially when you start picking up those prairie plants.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking not only about kind of the health of this forest, but also looking at specific spring ephemeral species. And immediately I am struck by all this green here. Here we have trout lily, and another name for this plant, I believe, is leaves of millions or leaves of many. And as the name indicates, or the common name rather, there are tons of bits of foliage, but only a few flowers bloom from this particular plant. So another reason to protect these areas, because it takes so much effort and energy for this plant to even create pollen and nectar. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting plant. Do you have any? Oh, actually, here we go. Here's one of the blooms. Not quite open yet. So this will open and look kind of, you know, like a lily. So has that open structure there. So I bet this will bloom here in the next day or so, especially if it warms up a bit. Okay. See, this is why I like hiking with naturals, because we barely made it past the trail. Okay. So another thing that we're seeing in this old growth woodland, or old growth forest, are invasive species. So here we have our old friend shrub honeysuckle, Lonicera macrocarpa. How do you say that in science? Scientific
I
words?
just call them bush honeysuckle.
I appreciate that.
And again, we've had contractors, and I've sprayed this before in the past, but again, there's no such thing as invasive species control anymore. That horse left the barn long ago. We're in suppression now, where we have to pick the areas that are ecologically important for us enough to spend the time and money and spray herbicides on them. But again, if I had a magic button that would kill every one of these plants in this 37 acres today, tomorrow a seed could come again. You know, it's in the seed bank itself. So we're never going to control these. What we have to do now is suppress them to a population small enough where they're not negatively impacting the ecosystem as little as possible. But absolute control is kind of gone.
Yeah, in addition to contractors and MDC working out here, I think, what is that? Oh my gosh. Do you know, okay, this is so exciting. Sorry, I'll come back to that question.
Good.
I
love the passion.
Oh, this is cool. Okay, this is yellow bellwort, I think. This is really cool. I see this at the Discovery Center, but not here. So I will include more information about this plant. But I first noticed this little sprout here, and I was like, that is different. That doesn't look like any of the things I know that I usually see out in spring ephemeral spaces. I also see little baby wild ginger popping up too.
There's a lot of wild ginger.
Yes, and I thought I saw a good leaf. Oh, here, these are even more bloomed. Yeah, look at that. Gorgeous. So it has this little yellow flower, and you can actually learn a lot by a plant without actually knowing the plant, just simply based on the shape of its flower and the positioning of it. So you'll notice a lot of our spring ephemerals will have their flowers pointing down, and typically more bell-shaped. And the reason for that is most of our early spring ephemerals are flies, bumblebees, different insects that are emerging from the soil and the leaf litter. And then as we get into warmer temperatures, you'll notice we have more upward facing composite flowers like asters and rudbeckias and things like that. So kind of cool. Working in this landscape is an immense group effort. And I'm just curious about some of the other organizations in addition to MDC that have helped support maple woods over the years.
Yeah, Kansas City Wildlands is a nonprofit group, and they help take care of the designated wildlands in the Kansas City metropolitan area, both on the Kansas and Missouri side of the river. And they've come out here several times in the past and helped with both bush honeysuckle removal, and there's a small stream that runs through this, and they've helped me remove garlic mustard on it too. So just two of the invasives we have here. My biggest worry on invasives here, just because control options are so limited and kind of spotty, is we'll see it when we get deeper into the forest here, but Callery Pear is going to be a big problem here.
Yes. So all the green foliage you're seeing up here on this hillside, that is all invasive shrub honeysuckle. So I tend to be a bummer for my friends not in conservation, because they're super excited about spring and all the green.
It was nice before you were educated, and green was good, right?
Green used to be so good, and now once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Well, and I'm old enough. I grew up in the in the suburbs of St. Louis on the Illinois side, and literally, it wasn't a problem yet. It hadn't got aggressive, and it hadn't got out as much. And yeah, we could see through the woods when I was little. And in a lot of our urban settings now, as you know, all you have to do is drive around, and you have literally 100% ground cover of bush honeysuckle, where it's almost impossible to walk through it, let alone see through it. So just in my lifetime, through aggressiveness of bush honeysuckle especially, but autumn and Russian olive and Callery Pear now, I've seen the environment baseline degrade, right? And it's called baseline. The newer foresters who are coming after me, who are working now, have never experienced what woods and forests were before these invasions. So their good stuff, the best habitat that they've seen, is noticeably degraded to what I've seen in my lifespan. So it's kind of sad.
It is sad, and I think one thing that does give me hope is people's awareness of invasives now more on a general level, and the fact that people are seeing how it's impacting our local communities, and now folks are interested in taking action. And I know it's not something that will ever be fixed, but it's something to be aware, again, like you were mentioning, like having priorities and goals and organizing to be able to save what few natural areas remain here.
Well, and just the resurgence of people wanting information on native plant communities and how to plant those in their yards is really hopeful to me. Yeah. And yeah, so hopefully it'll get a little better.
Yeah, that's my hope too. Oh wow, I can really see the valley here. Chuck, if somebody wanted to add an oak to their property, do you have any favorites?
I do, but I don't like to tell you that because I don't want 500 people planting the same oak, right?
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. So why is it important, not only in our natural areas, but in our like urban communities or suburbs, why is it important to have a variety of different species?
Just like your stock portfolio, diversity is pretty much free, right? It doesn't cost you anything to diversify. And if something goes wrong, like the importation of a tree pest that kills a specific species, if you've planted all of one species, and I'm old enough Dutch elm disease will pretty much, it didn't wipe out the American elm, but urbanized American elm, city tree planting where they were all on the boulevards and stuff, it ran through them. And then we imported emerald ash borer, which is killing all the white and green ash in our area. And there's a pest called Asian longhorned beetle, and it will prey on over 17 hosts that it has, but its preferred species are maple, and red maple was overplanted a lot in, and so it's good to have a diversity of species, so in case something gets imported, you may lose one tree in your yard, but not all 3 trees. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does.
And the more we live in a globalized economy now, right? We used to have slow boats that went from China to the US and back, but now think about how our transportation system is globalized. You can pretty much order an elephant, and if you've got enough money, in 2 days it's going to arrive at your house. Well, nothing in shipping, when it was a long process, if you didn't have a host plant or food or enough water, those pests would die in the transportation process because it took so long. Now that it's so fast, we get introductions of pests all the time. And we started by bringing everything over from Europe here because that was, we traded back and forth with Europe. And that's how we got Dutch elm disease and other diseases, chestnut blight. And then we started trading with Asia, and now we're getting, every year we look more like Asia and they look more like us through transportation of goods and services on these huge container ships. And as we bring other trading partners in, as other countries become more economically industrialized, and start becoming trading partners, South America, Africa, we're going to get different pests with them. So it's just the way to combat that is to keep natives in your yard, but diversify those. Especially most people in their yards only have room for a few trees at the most. And if you plant all of one, you're just taking a bigger risk of something impacting all those species at the same time.
Perfect.
A lot of May apples.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't even see those. I'm going to get a little shot here of this wild ginger. So here, in addition to spring ephemerals spotting the landscape, we have here little baby wild gingers. This is a fabulous ground cover species. I have it in my own backyard. It's starting to come up right underneath the leaf litter, and it will create a carpet over everything. So the Dutchman breeches foliage you see here will fade back. They go dormant, look like they've never been there, and then these heart-shaped leaves will cover the ground. And they're not just a cute leaf. They also have important nectar sources and food for our early pollinators like flies. The flowers are dark purple, they'll point down, they smell like rotten meat to attract our fly species. And then once those flowers are pollinated, the seeds actually have this coating on them which ants find delicious, and they will take that seed back to their colony. They will eat that coating off of it, and it's full of, I'm pretty sure, fats or proteins. And then once they're finished with that seed, they deposit it into their compost pile or their little trash in their colony, and that's how those seeds get around the forest, which I think is very fascinating. Okay, here we have another cool spring ephemeral. God, this place is loaded.
Oh, it's got some.
Dang. So here we have our friends, the May apples, and you can just see they've totally colonized this area, and they will eventually put up little flower, or put down little flowers that hang down underneath these umbrella looking leaves, and then they do produce something that looks like an apple, and box turtles find them irresistible, which I think is pretty cool. So just take a look at that. And again, notice no one's coming out here raking the leaves out of the forest. All these plants are fine, coming up on their own. So if you have a wood, like a really shady area in your garden with shade loving species, you don't need to get rid of all the leaves, if any of them at all. Oh, here you can really see the wild ginger coming out next to a ton of spring beauties and Dutchman's foliage. Look how cute that is. Here's an up close view of some of that honeysuckle. And when it's small like this, it's easy to go ahead and pull up the crown. Now, I'm only doing this here on the edge because I'm not seeing any other spring ephemerals right next to it. I wouldn't recommend pulling necessarily out of an area with spring ephemerals because their roots are under, you know, under the soil, and you run the risk of popping them out. But if you are to remove honeysuckle, make sure you get that crown out of the ground and either cut and stump treat with herbicide immediately or pop it out like I just did here. Do you know what kind of fern this is?
It's a fern? No, I do not.
I don't either. My guess.
There's supposed to be Christmas fern. Gosh, what were the others?
Would it? I know this isn't maidenhair because it has like black tips or something.
But maidenhair is supposed to be out here. I know
Okay.
that they've got a voucher of that here. So
Well, just wait for the magical title to appear on the screen after I ID this. Oh, and hey, looky here, we got some phlox. Not a spring ephemeral, but will be blooming soon. Woodland phlox. This is a hyper-local plant that is cultivated in stores, so rabbits do love it, but if you can't get it to grow in your backyard because of rabbits, consider putting it in a pot where they can't reach them.
And ferns are a really good indicator plant for forests too. You've got to be moist enough and cool enough with the shade. If you start seeing a lot of ferns in your understory, you're not in a woodland, not primarily. You're more on that forest continuum. You know, when you've got trees that they weren't harvested and there wasn't a stand replacing disturbance like a fire or anything in these trees' lifespan, where when you've got, again, it's so old now that the trees are naturally starting to die out of the canopy. So it is old here.
Yeah.
And they're being, again, the shade intolerant species are starting to melt out and they're getting replaced. It's going more to the maple because they can tolerate this understory shade when they're younger. And what'll happen is a big oak tree finally dies, and then the maples underneath it in the mid-story will take that place in the upper canopy again. And the oaks just can't do that because they'll grow up and be small like seedling sapling stage here, but if they don't get that release into sunlight through a death in the canopy or a canopy opening, they get suppressed, where when there is a canopy open, they just don't respond to that growth like maples do and other shade tolerant species. But this is awesome wildlife habitat here, you know.
I appreciate knowing that life continues despite the decline of the tree.
And they were getting old enough, just like people, the older you get, the less you can rebound from adverse health stuff. And for a tree, that's drought, right? So a lot of these trees that you see on the ground here are from the 2012 drought, and there will be much more dying from the past 2 years droughts here. That's going to speed this process up some. This area gets a ton of use.
I bet. There's more May apples. Something to think about too with invasive honeysuckle, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Chuck, but spring ephemerals are one of the first species you lose when invasive honeysuckle comes in, just due to the delicate nature of the ephemeral plants.
Well, the whole, yes, and as you can see with this, the reason they're ephemeral is because they have to complete their whole life cycle very quick before the trees put their leaves out. and shade them out.
Oh, that's right.
The problem with bush honeysuckle is they leaf out at the same time that the ephemerals are coming up, where if this gets concentrated enough, they can literally shade the ephemerals out because they're coming out at the same time too. So yeah, it's one of the biggest problems with bush honeysuckle is how fast they put that leaf canopy out and start shading the understory out.
Yeah, as well as holding on to their leaves pretty late in the
Yes.
season too.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that also that helps them take over a place, but it's also one of the reasons it's fairly easy to suppress, because in the fall, after everything else is dormant, they'll still have their leaves on, and glyphosate, Roundup's a trade name of it, kills everything that you spray. It's got to go through the leaves primarily. So we can come out and spray glyphosate, and the only thing that still has leaves on it is the bush honeysuckle plants. So we don't harm, like I could kill bush honeysuckle right now by foliar spraying it with glyphosate. The problem is I'm going to kill all the spring ephemerals out underneath it too, because it'll kill anything that lands on the leaf. But since it's so far in the fall, it stays leafed out for so long, nothing else is pretty much actively growing then except this. So we can target it with a broadband herbicide at that point. So what makes it good to take over is also its weak spot in controlling it with herbicides. The real problem is Callery Pear coming in, just because it's so difficult to control with herbicides. We don't have a really effective way of foliar spraying it now that does a good job of controlling it.
Ooh, is that Callery Pear?
Yes.
Okay, so here we go. I've got that waxy leaf, serrated edge, and I don't know, I think you can pull it.
They're about impossible.
Yeah.
And the problem is if they break on you, they're coming back.
Nope. Okay, so we have another invasive species here among the native plants. We got garlic mustard that is flowering. And so what's the best way to manage this type of invasive species?
If you can get it up, it's easy to pull.
Okay.
But the problem with it is, especially once it starts to flower, if you just pull it and throw it on the ground, it tends to still set seeds.
Oh gosh.
And
so you take it home and
you almost have to bag it up and remove it from the area and put it into the trash.
good to know. And does it smell like mustard or garlic?
You be the judge. Have you ever eaten it?
Ooh, no, but I've heard it's edible. And I
made
think
a
that's
pesto out of it
yum.
once, and it wasn't basil pesto.
It smells like garlic for sure. I'm gonna put this in my pocket. That smells really good. So yeah, good. And I believe that's how this escaped cultivation in the first place. Is that correct?
It was brought over from Europe as a food source.
Yeah. We got one of my favorite common flowers, common violet. Nothing common about it. I think it's gorgeous. Viola sororia. This is not to be mistaken for Viola odorata, which is the European variety. But yeah, I think this is a great ground cover species. It's also a good indicator if you have a lot of shade in your landscape. I like to look for clues before I even get started with planting, and this is a nice clue. Oh, and here is another violet species. Well, first let me show you how beautiful the modeling is on the trout lily leaf. And this is Viola pubescens. Oh, and look! That little, I scared a pollinator. Sorry, buddy. Someone took a little chomp out of that leaf, or petal rather. But yeah, so that's Viola pubescens, I believe. Different species. Oh wow, look at this big tree that came down.
This is my favorite tree in the natural area here, big old white oak. And you know, we've been talking about ephemeral plants, but you and I are ephemeral compared to this guy. So we're just a flash in the pan, right?
We sure are. And how old do you think this, any guesses on how old this oak is?
It's old, but just like people, how big we get and how old we get depends on our diet, our habitat, you know, for this, how much rainfall we've got, how much competition it's got, how good the soil is. But that's as old as the country right there. You know, I would say, you know, you're probably looking at well over 200 years.
Amazing.
But the only way to tell for sure is either get an increment bore out and take a core sample, or wait till it passes and do a cross section on it. But that's been around a long time.
All right. How about that woodland, or rather, old growth forest? Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to now welcome our guest speaker, Chuck Connor, to the virtual stage, and we're going to dive into some really great questions y'all put forward in the Q&A. If you have any other questions, please feel free to place them there, and we will answer as many of them as we can. And for those that we don't get answered, we will then go ahead and respond to those live or via email rather, following this webinar. Okay. Welcome, Chuck. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That was such a fun walk that we did just a couple weeks ago. And I bet with all this rain, the spring ephemerals have further spread out and opened up, huh?
You bet. You bet. I haven't got much at my house yet today, though, and I'm so dry. I hope we get some more rain. So
I hope you get some soon. We're getting it here in Kansas City, that's for sure. Okay, so Chuck, I'm going to ask you some questions that folks have put forward in the Q&A. And I'm going to go ahead and start with, let's see here. Sherry is asking, my family has a forest that is totally hedge, black locust, cedar, honeysuckle, and some walnut. How do you recommend starting an oak hickory forest? We've cleared large trails in the woods, but difficult to start trees. Do you have any general recommendations there?
well, it is going to be difficult because, again, the hickories are hard to transplant because they don't like having their taproot cut, and the oaks are shade or intolerant, where you almost have to start in large openings. So, and then the third thing, especially if it's in the urban area, is deer browsing on those young oak seedlings. If you're planting oaks, it's almost impossible to keep the deer off of them, white-tailed deer, without caging them. So it may be easier just to live with what she's got there and control the bush honeysuckle and other invasives in it, and just appreciate it for the woodland that it is, than trying to convert that back to a oak hickory woodland or forest. But if she does want to do it, it's going to require large openings to get enough sunlight to get those. And then I would use seedlings. The state nursery sells a lot of our native plant tree seedlings, and but it for the oaks especially, and they get browsed heavily by white-tailed deer. Where in a lot of places when I'm doing reforestation, I always plant oaks, but I don't count on any of them making through the seedling stage from browsing, unless you're willing to do exclusion caging on them.
That's really good to know. I recently heard about those like tubes that I think places sell to protect the trees for that exclusionary type scenario?
Well, the problem with those tubes is they usually stop about 3-4 foot tall, and a deer can get a lot taller than that. So
Good to know.
it's tough. It is extremely difficult to get oak recruitment in an urbanized small area.
Mm. So speaking of smaller trees, Fawn is asking if an herbicide is applied in the fall to control bush honeysuckle, would that kill newly sprouted trees like the oaks that you were discussing that are diminishing in this forest as an example?
Uh, no. And what happens, you've got to realize that we're usually targeting foliar spraying of honeysuckle at the end of October and the first couple of weeks of November. That depends naturally on what our weather is doing then. But most, if not all, plants are dormant at the time that the bush honeysuckle was getting sprayed, and it's still actively growing. So
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, Hunter is asking, I imagine one would ideally remove the cut down honeysuckle out of an area. Like, let's say you're managing it and then you remove it. But for large spaces, can you leave the honeysuckle to deteriorate on its own or mulch it? What's the best option there?
Well, the easiest option is just to leave it be. It'll break down in time, and realize when we foliar spray, we do the same thing. We're killing the plant, but the plant still stays as a dead upright plant, and they'll stay that way for about 3 years, and they start falling over and falling down and being recycled by fungi back into the environment. So if you want it to look prettier, though, I know of people who will either pile and burn in places if that's a viable option, or rent a small chipper and run them through a chipper. But for when you're trying to control honeysuckle, it's work. So if you're doing a cut stump treatment and stuff like that, I would recommend I wouldn't. It's much more important to suppress as much as you can than make it look pretty. So I just chop and drop, But again, if you're just cutting them down and you're not treating that stump with an herbicide, you'll set it back, but you're not going to kill it. It'll reflush from that crown and come right back. So unfortunately, for all of these invasive species, if you're going to do any kind of suppression efforts on a large scale, herbicide is going to have to be involved to be effective. So
Thank you for that. Okay, we have time to answer just a couple more questions. So this will be the rapid fire for you, Chuck. Carolyn mentioned, are there also a lot of elms and hackberry at Maple Woods due to heavy shade? Are they shade tolerant or intolerant?
They hackberries can grow in the shade, and so can the elms, and they are very common. The three most common trees, we did a partial inventory in the 9-county Kansas City metropolitan area, and the three most common trees were American elm, hackberry, and black walnut. And part of that is because they are common, they're prevalent, and the other part of it is a lot of them do well when they've been grazed in the past by cattle. And the other thing that's common with them is a lot of them will grow well next to creeks. And once you get a creek in a neighborhood, that's the one thing they couldn't bulldoze out before they put their houses and streets in. So they're remnants there on that. So, but yes, there are some hackberry. There are a few black walnut out at Maple Woods. There's quite a bit of elm out there in the understory too. And there's also, part of it is, like I said, it's called a maple, basswood, oak forest, but it's mixed hardwoods. There's hickory in there too. There's shagbark hickory and stuff. So there's a wide diversity of species in there, which is good. Like I said, the more diversity you have, the more different species of wildlife is going to rely on that ecological system.
Yeah, and this is actually a great segue. This is kind of a two-part, or actually two questions from two different people that go well together. So Barbara mentioned, speaking of biodiversity, white oak and other oaks are essential for many Lepidoptera birds and mammals. but she's reluctant to plant them in their small yard because of acorns.
Well,
Thoughts on that?
I agree that acorns can be somewhat messy, but we're going to have to learn to deal. We need a paradigm shift to how we're going to live as a species if we're going to continue to have a planet to live on as a species. We have got to get away from a clean look or a pristine monoculture. We have impacted so much of the landscape now that we're losing species at a record number. And if we can't learn to live with some acorn caps on our driveway and sidewalks, we're not gonna, our children and our grandchildren are gonna have a severely impacted lifestyle if we can't learn to be better stewards and be willing to not have a perfectly manicured ecosystem, because honestly, we just can't survive long-term in that kind of ecosystem.
Very well said, Chuck. And folks in the audience are applauding your remarks there. And I think folks who've tuned in understand that what you plant matters.
Yes.
So I just want to thank you, Chuck, for joining us today. It really was great to get to know you and spend time with you at Maple Woods, and for all of your insight today. And we hope to welcome you back on the show again in the future.
We'll do. We'll see you in October, right?
Yep, I'll see you then. All right, Chuck, you take care.
You too.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I want to just let you know our next webinar is Thursday, May 2nd at noon. Our Lunch and Learn with Missouri Department of Conservation will focus on garlic mustard ID and removal management. So please join us there and then. And in the meantime, thank you for tuning in today. And don't forget, what you plant matters.